Winter 1943, a country house called Trent Park. Snow crusted the gravel paths. Bare oak branches scratched at a gray sky. The mansion looked like something from a Christmas card. Chimneys smoking, tall windows warm with lamplight, a lawn rolling down toward frozen ponds. Nothing about it suggested a prison. Because it wasn't one, not the way the men inside understood the word. Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma walked the garden path in a wool overcoat, cigarette held between two fingers. 52 years old, lean, hawk-featured, the skin around his eyes creased from a decade of desert sun. Commander of the Africa Corps until the 3rd of November 1942, when a British sergeant found him beside a burning Panzer IV outside El Alamein and offered him a cup of tea. That was over a year ago now. Since then, von Thoma had been driven north through England, fed on white bread and mutton, given wine at dinner, a library, a billiard table, and the run of a garden that reminded him faintly of a Bavarian country estate. His fellow prisoner walked beside him. Ludwig Cruel, 51, broader shoulders, a duller face, a Knight's Cross recipient whose Fieseler Storch had been forced down over the Libyan desert on the 29th of May, 1942, when his pilot mistook a column of British troops for Italian allies and landed among them. The pilot was killed. Cruel walked out with his hands up. He had been at Trent Park longer than von Thoma, long enough to stop asking why the tea kept coming. The two men had been walking every afternoon for weeks, talking about Rommel, about Hitler, about the war they were no longer fighting. Today, von Thoma stopped near a stone bench at the edge of the lawn. He tapped ash from his cigarette. He looked out at the pond and began to speak, quietly, in German. He told Cruel about something a new arrival at Trent Park had described a few weeks earlier. A younger officer, captured in Tunisia, who had been on a ridge outside Kasserine when the Americans finally organized themselves and hit back. Not the shelling itself. Every soldier in this house knew shelling. But the shape of it, the way the American guns had arrived. There was no ranging shot, von Thoma said. No first round to correct from, no adjustment, no warning at all. And then every shell struck at once, from different bearings, different distances, impacting the same square of ground in the same second, as though a single hand had thrown them. Cruel made a small, dismissive sound. Rumors, he said. Frightened men exaggerate. Every army has good gunners on a good day. Von Thoma did not answer. He drew on his cigarette and watched a duck cut a line across the ice. Inside the mansion, they finished the afternoon at the billiard table. Cruel chalked his cue. Von Thoma poured wine from a decanter that never seemed to empty. They spoke of old friends, of the Eastern Front, of Rommel's latest embarrassment. Their laughter carried up into the plaster moldings of the ceiling. Their words moved into the wood of the billiard table itself, into the leather of the chairs, into the stones of the fireplace. And down, 3 floors below the ballroom, in a windowless corridor lit by bare bulbs, a young woman in a wool cardigan sat at a steel desk, headphones pressed to her ears, fingers moving across the keys of a typewriter. Her name is not important. There were more than 1,000 like her at the 3 site. Every one of them had signed the Official Secrets Act. Every one of them spoke fluent German. Most were refugees, Jewish Germans who had fled the Reich in 1938 and 1939, and now sat night after night transcribing the private thoughts of the men who had driven them out. The whole operation had a name that told no one anything. Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, United Kingdom. The man who built it was named Thomas Kendrick, an MI6 officer with a small mustache and a talent for making German generals feel comfortable. He had opened his first bugging site in the Tower of London in September 1939. By 1940, he had moved it here, to Trent Park, and by 1941, he had added 2 more houses in the countryside. Latimer House, Wilton Park. Over the course of the war, Kendrick's typists would transcribe more than 100,000 pages of secretly recorded conversation. Von Thoma did not know any of this. Cruel did not know any of this. When they poured wine, when they argued about Hitler at the dinner table, when von Thoma stood in his bedroom and confessed to Cruel that Germany had already lost the war, they believed they were speaking to a friend inside 4 walls. They would not learn otherwise in their lifetimes. The transcripts remained classified until 1996. By then, both men were long dead. But what von Thoma was starting to describe in that garden would be described over the next 3 years by German general after German general. Different armies, different fronts, men who had never met, whose experiences of the war had almost nothing in common. Every one of them beaten, every one of them looking for the same answer. And every one of them, when they got there, naming the same American weapon. Not the tank, not the bomber, not the rifleman. And this quiet, civilized betrayal in a country house in the snow is where the story of American artillery begins to be told. Not on a battlefield, in a garden, in a whisper, in a language the speakers thought no one else could hear. Because von Thoma had heard something new. And in the years that followed, general after general would come through this house, and this same subject would keep walking back into the room. 600 miles east, in a town called Würzburg on the River Main, a man named Fritz Bayerlein had just turned 45. He was not at Trent Park. He would never see it. That was part of the point. Bayerlein had been born in Würzburg on the 14th of January 1899, into a family that was not military and not rich. The Great War had reached him at 17. He had joined the 9th Bavarian Reserve Division as a private, not an officer cadet, and he had survived the last year of the Western Front, the mud, the gas, the collapse of everything he had been raised to believe. He had stayed in the shrunken army the Versailles Treaty allowed Germany to keep, 100,000 men. He had trained as a staff officer while other veterans of his generation drifted into unemployment and bitterness. When the Panzer Arm was born in the 1930s, he was one of the first to volunteer for it. By 1939, he was chief of staff of the 10th Panzer Division. He rode into Poland behind Heinz Guderian. He rode into France in May 1940, standing in a command half-track behind Guderian's shoulder as the panzer columns cut behind the French army and pinned it against the Channel. In 1941, he was sent east for Barbarossa. Then, at the end of that year, a telegram moved him to North Africa, to a headquarters tent in the Libyan desert, to a small, dust-caked field marshal named Erwin Rommel. Bayerlein became Rommel's chief of staff. He learned the Desert War, the sudden dawn attacks, the long fuel columns, the trick of hiding armor behind low ridges and letting the enemy commit to the wrong flank. He was there for Gazala. He was there for the first day of El Alamein. He escaped Tunisia before the surrender. In May 1943, one of the few senior officers Rommel personally requested be pulled out. By 1944, Hitler himself signed the order that gave Bayerlein his own division, Panzer Lehr, the teaching division. Every officer picked from the panzer schools, every tank fresh. No horses, none, in a Wehrmacht, where most divisions still moved on hooves. The most powerful armored formation the Reich would ever field on the Western Front. Bayerlein was proud. He had earned it. He was also, that spring of 1944, absolutely certain that he understood the American army. The reason he was certain had a name, Kasserine Pass. February 1943, a dry cut in the Tunisian mountains. Rommel had sent his panzers through it and slammed into the American Second Corps under a general named Fredendall, and in 3 days the American line had shattered like glass on tile. Bayerlein had been there. He had watched from a low ridge with binoculars as young Americans in olive drab climbed out of half-tracks and ran the wrong way. He had watched officers lose the map. He had watched Sherman tanks burn beside abandoned supply trucks, their engines still running. He had watched columns of prisoners drift back through the pass, leaderless, unweaponed, looking around them like men waking up in the wrong country. Later that night, in a tent lit by a single oil lamp, Bayerlein wrote his impression into a report. 3 words in the margin, in German shorthand. Green, loud, unfinished. The Americans, he concluded, were not yet an army. They had industry. They had numbers. They did not yet have soldiers. Time and blood would eventually make them one. But by the time they became dangerous, Germany would have already settled the war. Bayerlein was wrong. He did not know he was wrong. He would not know it for another 18 months. And on the same ridge, in the same week, wearing the same uniform of the same enemy he was measuring, another man was walking Tunisia. A man Bayerlein would never meet, whose name he would never write down. Leslie James McNair was 59 years old that spring, a month short of his 60th birthday. West Point, class of 1904. Artilleryman by branch, doctrine writer by temperament, the man George Marshall had once quietly called the brains of the army. He had trained every American ground division that would fight in this war. He had rewritten the manuals. He had built the schools. He had never asked to be famous, and he was not. On the 23rd of April, 1943, McNair was observing American infantry moving up a slope in northern Tunisia, standing where a general officer of the United States Army should not have been standing. A bomb, or a shell, the records disagree, burst near his position. Fragments went into his arm and into his head. The soldier next to him was killed outright. McNair went down bleeding into the dust and was carried out. He would live. He would receive a Purple Heart with his left arm in a sling, in a photograph that would appear briefly in American newspapers and then be forgotten. He would go back to Washington to keep building the army that would come ashore at Normandy. Bayerlein did not know McNair had been in Tunisia. Bayerlein did not know McNair existed. And Bayerlein certainly did not know that the system this quiet, wounded artilleryman had spent a decade helping to build, a system already finished, already trained, already loaded onto ships, was about to be used to destroy Panzer Lehr in a single morning. The system had not been born in Kasserine. Kasserine only sharpened it, taught the Americans about speed of deployment, and about how infantry and gunners needed to talk to each other. The core of it, the piece that would break the German army in the West, had been built years earlier, in silence, at a place no German general had ever heard of, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The wind came in flat off the plains. The buildings were low, white-painted, unremarkable. In summer, the grass burned yellow. In winter, it froze gray. There was a chapel, a mess hall, a firing range, and a schoolhouse where officers with slide rules and grid maps taught other officers how to shoot. In the early 1930s, a colonel named Carlos Brewer was head of the gunnery department there. Mid-40s. Careful, methodical, the kind of officer who spent evenings alone with logarithm tables. Beside him worked a major named Orlando Ward, the same Orlando Ward who would later command an armored division in Tunisia. Together, and with a rotating group of instructors that eventually included a lieutenant colonel named H.L.C. Jones, they built something no one else in the world was building. They called it the Fire Direction Center. The idea was small and enormous at once. Take the arithmetic of aiming a gun, the range tables, the wind correction, the powder temperature, the elevation, the deflection, and pull it out of the individual battery. Put it in one room, give that room radios, give it a grid map. Let one lieutenant at the front line, crawling in a ditch with a handset, speak a set of coordinates. And let that room translate those coordinates in real time into firing solutions for every battery within range. 12 battalions of guns, firing from 12 different positions, all landing on the same square of ground, in the same second. They had a name for that too. Time on target. They ran it in exercises through the 1930s. They refined it. They wrote it into the field manuals. When the war came, every American artillery officer trained on it. Every forward observer trained on it. Every radio operator trained on it. No one in Germany noticed. Heinz Guderian, the father of the German Panzer Arm, published his manifesto. In 1937, it ran to more than 200 pages. It laid out the future of armored warfare. It said not one word about American artillery. Not one word about Fort Sill. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, kept detailed files on every foreign army it considered relevant. Its file on the United States Army in the interwar period was thin. What was in it concerned uniforms, ranks, industrial capacity, and the doctrine of the tank corps. There was no entry for a schoolhouse in Oklahoma. And so, in the winter of 1943, as von Thoma walked in a snowy English garden and told Cruel about shells that arrived without warning, the machine that would produce those shells was already built, already trained, already waiting. It only needed a target, Normandy. St. Gilles, the 25th of July, 1944. Fritz Bayerlein was standing outside his command post when he heard it. Not a sound at first, a pressure, a low, distant vibration in the summer air, coming from the north, from the coast, from where the Americans were. He looked up. The sky was full. Later, when he tried to describe it to men who had not been there, he ran out of words. He said it was like a conveyor belt. One formation of aircraft crossing the horizon, then another behind it, then another, then another. B-17s, B-24s, 1,500 four-engine bombers, flying in tight box formations at 12,000 feet, their wings catching the late morning sun. They were coming for him. Bayerlein stood in the doorway of his command post and understood. Understanding changed nothing. He shouted an order. It was not heard. The first bombs were already falling. 3,300 tons of high explosive fell in a corridor 6 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. It fell in waves, back and forth, one lane at a time, the way a farmer plows a field. The bombs were not aimed at anything in particular. They were aimed at everything. The earth beneath Panzer Lehr rose up and came down again. Trees went sideways. Farmhouses collapsed in on themselves. Panther tanks, 60 tons of steel, flipped like children's toys. Half-tracks disappeared. Men in foxholes were buried alive by the concussion of the next hole opening 10 meters away. The German artillery batteries, dug in behind stone walls, ceased to exist as batteries. They became craters with dead men in them. Bayerlein walked out into it when the noise finally broke. He would write about that walk later, in a cell in Allendorf for American historians. He wrote it plainly. He said his division was gone. He said at least 70% of his personnel were out of action, dead, wounded, driven mad, or simply sitting on the ground staring at nothing. He wrote that men who had lived through Kursk, men who had survived the winter retreat from Moscow, climbed out of their holes and ran in circles in the open until the splinters cut them down. He called it hell. He used the word in German, Die Hölle. He was 50 years old, a professional soldier since he was 17, and he had never seen anything like it. He blamed the bombs. He would blame the bombs for the rest of his life. He was wrong. At almost the same moment, 4 kilometers north of Bayerlein's command post, near the village of Saint-Lô, a 61-year-old American 3-star general was standing in a hedgerow watching the same bombing raid from the other side. Leslie McNair had come to Normandy to observe. He was not in command of anything real. He had been given a phantom role. The fictional commander of a fictional army group meant to keep German intelligence looking at the wrong beach. But he had also come because it was Cobra, because this operation was the first battlefield use, at scale, of the ground combat doctrine he had spent 12 years writing. He wanted to see it work. He was standing in a foxhole with his aide when a formation of American B-24s released its bombs early. The wind that day was pushing dust and smoke back over the American lines. The bombardiers, unable to see the target, released on the marker they thought they saw. The bombs walked north instead of south. They walked into the hedgerows where the U.S. 30th Infantry Division was waiting to jump off. They walked into McNair's position. More than 100 Americans died that morning to their own bombs. McNair was one of them. His body was identified by the 3 stars on his collar. His widow, Claire, would collapse when the telegram arrived. She would later destroy most of his personal papers in grief. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat anywhere in the Second World War. He would be posthumously promoted to full general, 4 stars, 10 years later. And this is what makes that morning strange, even now, at this distance. At almost the exact hour that Fritz Bayerlein walked through the ruins of Panzer Lehr and blamed American bombs for what had happened to his men, the American general, who had built the system that was actually about to destroy them, lay dead in an American hedgerow, killed by the same bombs. 2 men, enemies, a few kilometers apart, their fates crossing in the same square of French farmland, in the same square of a single hour. One survived to be broken by the machine. The other died before he could see the machine work. Bayerlein never learned McNair's name. The bombs were not what killed Panzer Lehr. The bombs opened the door. What came through the door was worse. For 3 days after the 25th of July, the shattered remnants of Bayerlein's division tried to do what German panzer divisions had always done: pull back, reorganize, and counterattack. Bayerlein was a good general. His officers were good officers. The men who had not been killed or driven mad were experienced, hard men, veterans of the Eastern Front. They had rebuilt worse situations before. They did not rebuild this one. Every time a battalion of Panzer Lehr tried to reassemble in a wood line, the wood line came apart. Every time a company of tanks moved into position along a hedgerow, the hedgerow came apart. Every road junction where a German officer tried to sort out his stragglers was pre-registered on American maps and turned to iron and fire within minutes. Bayerlein sent a Panzer IV company forward at dawn on the 27th into a stand of trees near La Chapelle-en-Jugère. Engines muffled, tracks wrapped in rags, radio silence until the jump-off. At 4 in the morning, the company sat in the wood, invisible, waiting. At 4:14, the treetops came apart above them. No aircraft, no spotter plane visible in the dark, just the shells, all of them, arriving at once. When the American infantry moved forward at first light, they found the wood full of burning steel and dead crews. Some of the tanks had never fired their main guns. Bayerlein still thought it was the bombs. It was not the bombs. Somewhere in a ditch or a barn or a church tower, a few hundred meters from the wood, an American lieutenant with a map case and a radio had watched Panzer Lehr's tanks arrive under the cover of darkness. He had counted the engines. He had read a grid reference from the map on his knees. He had spoken 12 or 15 words into a handset. 3 minutes later, every American gun within range had answered. The lieutenant was already crawling away when the shells fell. To understand what had happened to Bayerlein, you have to understand the piece of American military machinery that no monument in Washington was ever built to commemorate. Every American infantry division in Normandy carried it. Every armored division carried it. It was not a weapon. It was a room. The room was called a fire direction center. It was usually a tent or a farmhouse cellar or the back of a truck. Inside it were maps, radios, telephones, a firing chart, and half a dozen men with sharpened pencils and slide rules. Those men were connected forward, by radio, by field telephone, by wire strung along hedgerows, to lieutenants like the one who had watched Panzer Lehr's tanks. Those lieutenants were called forward observers. Their job was to see and to describe. The men in the room were connected backward, by radio and telephone, to 12 battalions of artillery. 144 guns, sometimes more. When a forward observer spoke a grid reference, the men in the room did the arithmetic. They calculated the range, the wind, the powder temperature, the elevation, the direction of fire for each battery from wherever that battery happened to be sitting. And then they gave every battery its own answer over the radio, all at the same time. The batteries fired. Because the guns were at different distances from the target, the men in the room told each battery to fire at a slightly different moment. The nearer guns fired last, the farther guns fired first. The shells traveled through the air at different times, along different paths. They arrived on the target in the same second, time on target. That was the American phrase. TOT, the whole cycle, from the observer's voice on the radio to the first steel landing on the target, took 3 to 5 minutes. On a good day, 3. The German equivalent, a phone call from an observer to a battery commander, followed by a request to the divisional artillery officer, followed by coordination with neighboring units. Took 30 minutes on the best day of the war. On a bad day, an hour. On a very bad day, no coordinated shoot happened at all. 3 minutes or 30. That was the arithmetic of the summer of 1944 in France. That was what Bayerlein had walked into. That was what he was still blaming on bombs. 2 weeks after Cobra, Adolf Hitler ordered a counterattack. His generals begged him not to. They knew what was coming. They had watched Bayerlein's division die. They understood that the front had cracked. They wanted to pull back to the scene and save what was left of the German army in France. Hitler refused. He wanted 4 panzer divisions, the 1st SS, the 2nd SS, the 2nd, and the 116th, to punch west from the town of Mortain, cut through the American Third Army's supply corridor, and reach the coast at Avranches. It was a fantasy. He gave the order anyway. The operation was called Lüttich. It began in the dark hours before dawn on the 7th of August, 1944. The Germans did not know that their radio traffic, the traffic that ordered the divisions to their jump-off points, had been intercepted almost as soon as it was sent. They did not know that the Enigma cipher machines they trusted had been broken by British codebreakers at Bletchley Park 2 years earlier. They did not know that a source called Ultra, unknown to almost every American general in France, had put Hitler's order at Bradley's desk before their tanks had even finished topping up their fuel tanks. Omar Bradley knew. Bradley did not tell his corps commanders how he knew. He simply told them where to move their guns. And so, when the 4 German panzer divisions rolled forward in the pre-dawn dark of the 7th of August, they rolled into a landscape that had been quietly prepared for them. On a ridge east of Mortain, an American infantry regiment, the 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division, a National Guard outfit from the Carolinas, nicknamed Old Hickory, had dug in the day before. On the highest ground, a piece of steep bare hilltop the Americans marked on their maps as Hill 314, 200 men held a perimeter perhaps 300 meters across. One of those men had the right radio. His name was First Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss, 24 years old. A forward observer from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion sent up the hill the day before the German attack with a handset and a set of maps. Beside him, holding the crest with 200 infantrymen and no way out, was Captain Ralph A. Curley of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment. Curley had the men, Weiss had the guns. Within hours of the German attack, Hill 314 was surrounded. Panzers rolled past its base on both sides. Panzer Grenadiers climbed its lower slopes and were shot back down. The Americans on the hill had no water, almost no food, and no way out. Their radios were the only thing they still had that mattered. For 6 days, Weiss called fire. He watched German battalions move down the roads below him. He read the grids off his map. He spoke into his handset. 3 minutes later, the roads erupted. He watched panzer companies form up for another attack. He spoke into his handset. 3 minutes later, the panzer companies came apart. The Americans fired more than 20,000 rounds of artillery into a strip of French farmland, roughly 10 kilometers square during that week. Most of it came from the observations of one artillery lieutenant on a hilltop who could not leave, could not sleep, and by the 4th day could barely stand up. Beside him, Curley's infantrymen held the perimeter with rifles and grenades, and Weiss's radio between them and annihilation. By the 13th of August, the German counterattack was over. Panzer Lehr was not there. Bayerlein was elsewhere, trying to salvage his own division, but he heard it happen on the radio net. He heard officers he knew go off the air. He heard the whole shape of it. Lüttich had committed the last German armored reserves in the West. It had committed them into a shooting gallery. Bradley had known. Weiss and Curley had done the rest. By the middle of August, in the surviving German command posts of Normandy, there was a story going around. It was not written down. It was passed between officers over coffee, in the pauses between air raids. It went like this. You are in a defensive position, trench line, or foxholes, or a stone farmhouse. You are experienced. You are quiet. You know your fieldcraft. You have kept your men off the ridgeline and out of the open. You believe you are hidden. You hear something, not tank engines, not aircraft, not boots, a faint crackle, static, a voice muffled, cut off almost as soon as it starts. The men in the position who came from the east know that sound. They have heard it in Belarusia, in Ukraine, in Romania. They know what it is. It is an American walkie-talkie. The sergeant is already shouting. Men are grabbing rifles, kicking rucksacks off firing steps, throwing themselves flat against the walls of the trench. The story never says how the men know to move. They just do. They have learned. 3 minutes, sometimes nothing. Usually everything, every gun within range answers at once. The trench line, the farmhouse, the position that was supposedly hidden, all of it becomes a hole in the ground. The men who moved live. The men who froze do not. The forward observer who called the shoot is not there anymore. He read the grid and left. His voice was on the net for 4 seconds. He is already gone, crawling through a hedgerow looking for the next German position. A soldier who lived through this, and thousands did, carried the sound for the rest of his life. Not the sound of the shells, the sound of the crackle. Here is what German veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad, said about the American artillery. And this is worth listening to, because these were not frightened boys. They were the hardest infantry the world had produced. They said the terror was not the explosion. The explosion was almost a relief. The explosion meant that the wait was over. The terror was the silence before it. Because Russian artillery, Soviet artillery, always fired a ranging shot. 1 round, high or wide, so the battery commander could correct his aim. Then a pause, then the real barrage. The ranging shot was a warning. It gave you 30 seconds, sometimes a full minute. You could run, you could dig deeper, you could pull your men out of the open. American artillery had no ranging shot. By the time you heard the first American shell, 300 more were already in the air. There was no time to move. There was no window. There was only the crackle, 3 minutes of nothing, and then the whole world coming down at once. Men who had survived the winter of 1941 in Russia, Men who had climbed out of collapsed cellars in Stalingrad sat in French farmyards with their backs against stone walls and did not speak for hours after a shoot ended. Their sergeants looked at them and understood. They had not been wounded. They were simply gone. Bayerlein went into a hospital in Germany that autumn. When he came back, Panzer Lehr had been rebuilt again, with new tanks and new crews and a much smaller cadre of the old veterans. On paper, it looked like a division. On the ground, it was thinner than before, more brittle, more dependent on speed and surprise. In November, Hitler summoned his generals to the Wolf's Lair and told them the plan. The last great German offensive of the war would come out of the forests of the Ardennes in the depths of winter, aimed at Antwerp. Panzer Lehr was part of it. Bayerlein was told his division would drive on Bastogne. He had one advantage he understood, down to his bones: weather. The plan required cloud. Cloud was armor. Cloud meant no American aircraft in the sky, and no aircraft meant at last that pilots could not see the movements of German columns. But there was something else the cloud gave him. If the sky was thick enough and the fog dense enough, the American forward observers on the ground would be blind too. They could not see what they could not describe, and what they could not describe they could not kill. On the 16th of December 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile front. Fog rolled between the trees. The American lines, held by tired divisions and green replacements, buckled. Panzer Lehr moved forward through the mist. For 4 days, the fog was Bayerlein's armor. His division advanced. He was almost cheerful. On the 22nd of December, a panzer general named Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the XLV Panzer Corps, the corps that held Panzer Lehr, sent an officer under a white flag into the town of Bastogne. Von Luttwitz was 48, monocled, professional, and utterly certain that the American paratroopers ringed inside the town were finished. The officer carried a typed message demanding the honorable surrender of the encircled American garrison. He was received by the Americans, blindfolded, and taken to the commanding officer, a brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe was asleep when they woke him. He read the message. He looked up. He said a single word: nuts. His staff had to explain to the Germans what the word meant. It was not quite a translation any of them were prepared for. But the reason McAuliffe could afford to say it was not paratrooper courage. It was arithmetic. Inside the Bastogne perimeter, in wood lines and gullies and behind stone walls, sat 11 battalions of American artillery, more than 130 guns. And behind them, in supply dumps that had been rushed forward before the roads closed, sat something on the order of 30,000 rounds of ammunition. And something else. Something the Germans had never seen used on a battlefield. On the 16th of December, the same day Hitler's offensive began, Eisenhower had signed an order authorizing the use of the proximity fuse, the VT fuse, against ground troops in Europe. It had been Allied only for years, kept off the battlefield because of the fear that a dud might fall into German hands and be reverse-engineered. Now the situation was desperate enough that the ban was lifted. The first VT rounds went out on the 18th. A VT fuse is a tiny radio inside the nose of an artillery shell. The shell falls, the radio senses the ground rising up to meet it, and the shell explodes at a set distance above the surface. 20 meters. 15. The shrapnel comes down as a cone. Ordinary artillery buries itself in the earth before it detonates. Most of the blast goes up and out. Men in slit trenches, men in foxholes, men lying flat behind walls. Most of them survive most of it. A VT shell explodes over their heads. There is no trench deep enough. There is no wall high enough. Every square meter of ground under the airburst becomes lethal at once. A single battery of 6 guns firing VT can turn a company of infantry moving in the open into a company of the dead in less than a minute. The Germans in the Ardennes did not know what was hitting them. They knew only that when they went forward into open ground, in numbers, in the daylight, they came apart in ways they had never come apart before. On the 21st of December, 25 kilometers north of Bastogne, near a Belgian village called Butgenbach, an American infantry regiment held a low ridge across the axis of advance of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, one of the most fanatical formations in the German army. The 12th SS attacked and attacked and attacked. In one day, along that single ridge, American artillery fired more than 10,000 rounds into the 12th SS's forming positions and its assault waves. Whole Panzer Grenadier battalions were caught in the open by TOT missions. The proximity fuse was in the mix by then. The German attacks came apart in the snow before they had properly begun. Panzer Lehr was to the south of that fight. Bayerlein heard Bütgenbach on the radio net. He listened to a division that was supposed to be one of the spearheads of the entire offensive get ground into snow by American guns. He understood. He did not need to see it. He was 50 years old. He had lived a long war. He had seen the German army do things no other army in history had done. And listening to that radio traffic on the 21st of December, standing in a farmhouse somewhere between Wiltz and Bastogne, Bayerlein understood that the offensive had already failed. The fog would lift eventually. The sky would clear. When it did, the crackle would come back on his own frequencies, and the wood lines would come apart above his own men. He kept driving on Bastogne anyway. There was nothing else to do. Panzer Lehr never reached Bastogne. By Christmas Day, the sky over the Ardennes had cleared. The fog that had been Bayerlein's armor lifted like a curtain, and the American aircraft came back, and behind the aircraft came the crackle of forward observers on frequency Bayerlein could hear in his own command post. He listened to his companies come apart in wood lines he had ordered them into. He listened to his tanks stop answering. By early January, Panzer Lehr was a division on paper only. Half its tanks were burning in Belgian fields, half its men were gone. Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, called Bayerlein forward. Von Manteuffel was small, sharp, cold. He had watched Bayerlein's advance stall. He had watched a division that should have taken Bastogne fail to take Bastogne. He did not want explanations. On the 19th of January, 1945, Manteuffel relieved him. The official language was diplomatic, lackluster performance, insufficient aggression. There was no court-martial. There was no disgrace. Bayerlein was simply moved sideways into the Führer Reserve, and then, 5 weeks later, given a smaller command he did not want. Army Corps, a patchwork of tired battalions defending the industrial heart of Germany. He took it because there was nothing else to take. By April, his corps was inside the Ruhr pocket, encircled with 317,000 other German soldiers by an American army that was no longer stoppable. The war had 2 weeks left. Everyone in that pocket knew it. Hitler had ordered a fight to the last man. Bayerlein looked at the map. He looked at his men, most of them boys and old civilians in ill-fitting uniforms. He looked at the American artillery on every ridge to the west. He had been 50 for 3 months. He was very tired. On the 15th of April, 1945, Fritz Bayerlein arrested the 2 officers on his staff who wanted to keep fighting. He sent a runner across the American lines under a white flag. He surrendered his corps, some 30,000 men, to Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck of the U.S. 7th Armored Division. It was the first mass surrender inside the Ruhr pocket. Within days, the pocket collapsed entirely. 24 German generals went into captivity. Field Marshal Model, who had commanded them all, walked into a wood outside Duisburg and shot himself. Bayerlein did not shoot himself. He surrendered his pistol. He asked, in careful English, for permission to take his personal papers with him. He was driven west through burning towns, past columns of German prisoners walking the other way, toward a barracks in a small Hessian town he had never heard of. The town was called Allendorf, and in a plain brick building there, a young American captain would put a stack of blank paper in front of him and ask him to start writing. The program had a number. It was called the Foreign Military Studies. It was run out of the U.S. Army's Historical Division, and its purpose was simple. The Americans wanted to understand, in the words of the men who had done it, exactly how the German army had fought. They gave paper, they gave typewriters, they gave enough food and coffee and cigarettes to make the writing possible. They asked questions and waited for answers. Bayerlein wrote. He wrote a great deal. He wrote a study catalogued as A903, 16 pages on Panzer Lehr's operations from the 15th to the 20th of July, 1944, the days just before Cobra. He wrote A902, 4 pages on the 24th and 25th of July, on the bombing itself, on the destruction of his division. He wrote A901 on the withdrawal from France after Normandy. He gave 3 long interviews, the Americans, catalogued as ED&T 66, 67, and 69. One on his command of Panzer Lehr from January to July of 1944, one on the Normandy breakthrough, one on his role at the start of Operation Cobra. He wrote plainly. He named his mistakes. He named his losses. He did not spare himself. When the Americans asked him what had broken Panzer Lehr, he could have said the bombs. He had blamed the bombs at the time. He had blamed the bombs in his letters home. He did not blame the bombs now. He pointed at the artillery. He pointed at time on target, at forward observers, at a system he now understood, in retrospect, because the Americans had let him read some of their own manuals in captivity. He pointed at Fort Sill without knowing that Fort Sill was a place. Word of this got out. In the barracks at Allendorf, and later at Neustadt, and in the cafes of post-war West Germany where old officers gathered to grieve, Bayerlein's cooperation was noticed. It was not forgiven. Certain of his former colleagues, men who had spent the same captivity writing evasions and self-serving lies, began to call him something worse than a defeated general. They called him a traitor. Some of them sent him letters. A few of the letters, according to post-war accounts, were direct threats. He kept writing. He believed, with a kind of stubborn accuracy that surprises you when you read the studies today, that the Wehrmacht had been beaten by something specific, something identifiable, and that the historians deserved to know what it was. He thought this even when the historians were the men who had beaten him. He was released from captivity in April 1947. He had been a prisoner for exactly 2 years. He was never charged with any war crime. There is no evidence in the record that he had committed one. He went home to Würzburg, the town he had been born in, and he tried to disappear. Somewhere in the same period, in filing cabinets in a London building the public did not know existed, another archive was thickening. Trent Park had closed. The generals who had walked its garden paths, von Thoma, Cruel, von Arnim, and the more than 50 others who had come and gone, had been released or transferred to other custody. The typists in the basement had gone home. The microphones in the billiard table had been removed and packaged into wooden crates. The transcripts, more than 100,000 pages of them, had been sealed under a stamp that read "Top Secret" and filed. They stayed sealed for a very long time. It was only decades later, in 1996, that a British government finally lifted the classification. A German historian named Sönke Neitzel was one of the first scholars to see the transcripts in bulk. He read for years. In 2007, he published a book called Tapping Hitler's Generals. Other volumes followed, one of them written with Harold Welser, a social psychologist. Together, they laid out what the microphones had heard. Across hundreds of separate conversations, von Thoma to Cruel, Cruel to von Arnim, one general to another over wine at a table in a country dining room. The same subject came back into the room again and again. The generals argued about Hitler. They argued about the Eastern Front. They argued about Rommel and Guderian and each other. They argued about American infantry, whom most of them dismissed. They argued about American tanks, which they considered inferior. On the American guns, the room grew quiet. They did not argue. They agreed. Von Thoma, who had first heard the reports from Tunisia, von Arnim, who had surrendered his army there in May 1943, officers who had fought in Normandy, in the Ardennes, along the German border in the winter of 1944, men who had never met, whose fronts had never touched, whose experiences of the war had almost nothing in common. On this, they sounded like a chorus. There was, they said, no answer. Skill slid off it. Courage slid off it. The perfectly chosen reverse slope position slid off it. The Reich had built no counter, they said, because there was no counter to build. You could dig deeper. You could stay off the radio. You could move at night. And still, in the end, some American lieutenant in a ditch would speak a grid reference. And 3 minutes later, the position would be gone. They said this to men they thought were friends, in a house they thought was empty of listeners, and every word of it went onto typed pages that would not be read for half a century. By the time the pages were read, all of those generals were dead. There is one more thing worth saying about this story, and it is uncomfortable. America remembers the war it wants to remember, the Sherman tank, General Patton with his ivory-gripped revolvers, the P-51 Mustang in a blue sky over Berlin, the Marine on Mount Suribachi. These are our images. They live in our films and our memorials and the flags in our small town squares. American artillery does not live in any of that. Fort Sill still stands out on the Oklahoma plains. The wind still comes flat off the grass. The field artillery school still teaches time on target, though the technology now is satellites and computers instead of slide rules and typewriter tables. But the men who built the doctrine, the men in that schoolhouse in the 1930s, they are not remembered. Carlos Brewer retired in 1946 as a brigadier general. He died in 1966. There is no monument to him. Most Americans have never heard his name. Orlando Ward, the major who had helped him, went on to command an armored division and was quietly relieved after Kasserine. He died in 1972. He is not remembered either. The doctrine they built, the small, unglamorous arithmetical thing that made an American lieutenant with a radio worth more on a Normandy afternoon than a German panzer regiment, is remembered only by the men who lost to it. Only the enemy in his defeat kept the accurate memory. In the transcripts of Trent Park, in the studies at Allendorf, in the private letters of old German officers writing to each other in the 1950s and 1960s, trying, one more time, to explain what had happened to them. Fritz Bayerlein lived 23 years after his release. He never wrote a memoir. He gave a small number of interviews, mostly to American and British historians who came to Würzburg looking for him. He was polite. He answered their questions carefully. He almost never talked about Rommel. He almost never talked about Guderian, his time in the desert, his time on the Eastern Front, his time as one of the trusted young men in the Panzer Arm. Those subjects seemed to have gone quiet inside him. What he came back to, in interview after interview, was a summer morning near a French village he had never planned to see again. He would describe the sound of the aircraft first, then the earth, then the walk through his own division afterward. Then, more quietly, he would talk about the days after. The wood line at 4 in the morning, the tank company that had never fired, the sergeant who had come out of Russia and could no longer speak. And he would talk about the crackle. He always came back to the crackle. The 4 seconds of static on a captured American radio. The 4 seconds that had told his soldiers, in the last summer of the war, that they had less than 3 minutes to live. He died on the 30th of January, 1970, in the town where he had been born. He was 71 years old. His obituary in the local paper was short. The Germans came to the war with the greatest tanks in history. The Americans came to the war with a slide rule, a radio, and a gridded map. Only one of them came home.